At the British Museum, the silence at night wasn't just the absence of sound. It was something physical, something that settled into the bones. It pressed down on Samir as he walked his usual route, his rubber-soled footsteps echoing faintly against stone that had outlived empires. 32, far from home, and carrying the quiet weight of a life that hadn't quite gone as planned, Samir had taken the night security job for one simple reason. It asked nothing of him. No conversations, no explanations, just hours of walking, watching, existing. Over time, the museum had stopped feeling like a workplace and had become something stranger, almost intimate. He knew its moods. He knew how the air shifted in the great court, how moonlight filtered through the glass ceiling and fell like pale water across the marble floor, how certain corridors always felt colder than others for no logical reason. The artifacts, once awe-inspiring, had become like silent companions, predictable, unmoving, safe. But tonight, as he stepped into the Egyptian wing, something felt off. The air was heavier, thicker, carrying a faint scent he couldn't place at first. Dry earth, maybe. Or something older, like spices sealed in a tomb. His grip tightened slightly on the torch as its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating towering statues and carved faces that seemed, just for a second too long, to be watching him back. Room 63, the Gallery of Death and Afterlife, was where he always slowed down, though he never admitted why. Rows of sarcophagi stood like sentinels, their presence more imposing in the dark, their painted eyes catching fragments of light and holding them. At the center rested the gilded coffin of Princess Ankasara. Compared to the grander tombs, it was understated, almost restrained. But there was something about it that had always unsettled him. Not fear exactly, but a quiet, persistent sadness that didn't belong in a museum label. Tonight, that feeling sharpened into something else, something closer to anticipation. As his torch drifted across the display, something unusual caught his eye. A small clay tablet sat on a lower shelf, slightly out of place, as if it had been forgotten or overlooked during some past curation. He frowned, stepping closer. A thin layer of dust coated it, undisturbed for what must have been months, maybe years. Carefully, almost instinctively, he wiped it clean with his sleeve. Hieroglyphs revealed themselves, etched with precision. But what made him pause was the faded phonetic transcription beneath them. Someone long ago had tried to give these words a voice. Samir hesitated. He wasn't superstitious, not really. But there was something about reading words meant to stay silent that felt wrong. Still, curiosity won. In the vast emptiness of the hall, his voice felt small as he began to sound them out. Slowly, uncertainly, each syllable echoing just a fraction longer than it should have. Aineskara, Heinu, Piramhru. As he spoke the final word, his fingers unconsciously tracing the carved symbols, the clay cool beneath his touch, the world changed. The temperature dropped instantly, a sharp, unnatural cold that cut through his uniform and into his skin. The soft, ever-present hum of the museum's systems died without warning, plunging the room into a silence so complete it felt suffocating. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then came the vibration. Low, deep, almost inaudible at first, but growing, resonating through the stone beneath his feet and up through his body like a distant, awakening heartbeat. The lights above flickered violently, throwing the gallery into chaotic bursts of light and shadow. The statues around him seeming to shift, to lean, to come alive in the strobing darkness. Samir stumbled back, his breath quickening, his mind scrambling for logic, for anything that made sense. And then he heard it, the sound that would follow him for the rest of his life. Stone grinding against stone, slow, heavy, deliberate. His head turned, almost against his will, toward the sarcophagus. The massive lid was moving, not falling, not breaking, sliding, smoothly, as if guided by an unseen hand, as if something inside had decided to wake up. His body refused to respond. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs remained locked, his eyes fixed on the impossible scene unfolding before him. The lid shifted further, inch by inch, until gravity took over and it crashed to the ground with a deafening impact that echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Silence followed. Thick, heavy, unbearable. And then, slowly, something inside the coffin moved. At first, it was just a shape, rising, wrapped tightly in ancient linen, brittle and darkened with time. It sat up with unnatural grace, not the jerky, broken motion he had seen in films, but something controlled, intentional. A hand lifted, slender and precise, and began to unwind the wrappings from its face. Samir watched, unable to look away, his fear transforming into something deeper, something colder. Layer by layer, the linen fell away, revealing skin. Not decayed, not skeletal, but preserved, impossibly intact, pale and smooth as if time had simply paused around her. And then the eyes opened. Not dull, not lifeless, alive, sharp, burning with a depth of awareness that shattered every assumption he had about death. They locked onto him, and in that moment, Samir understood. This was not something that had returned blindly. This was something that had waited. When she spoke, the sound was dry, like wind moving through sand. Yet the meaning arrived directly in his mind, clear and undeniable. She named herself Ankasara, daughter of the sun, rightful heir. And as she rose fully from the coffin, the remnants of her wrappings falling silently around her, she carried not confusion, not rage without direction, but purpose. She spoke of betrayal, of a father who had promised her a kingdom and then condemned her when a son was born, of priests who had sealed her fate while he watched. There was no hysteria in her voice, only certainty sharpened by centuries. When Samir finally managed to ask what she intended to do, her expression shifted, not into anger, but into something far more terrifying. Calm. She spoke of bloodlines, of legacy, of how those who had condemned her had not vanished but had thrived, their descendants spreading across nations, hiding behind power and influence. Her war, she made clear, was not against the world, but against them. And as she stepped past him, her form beginning to dissolve into the shadows that clung unnaturally to the walls, her voice lingered, echoing inside him rather than around him. She would erase her father's lineage completely, without mercy, without end. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The cold lifted, the hum returned, the light steadied, the museum exhaled. Samir stood alone once more, trembling in the aftermath, the normalcy of the room now feeling like a lie. The shattered sarcophagus lay open, empty, its secret gone. He reached for his radio, his fingers shaking, ready to call it in. But the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say? That history had just stood up and walked away? Slowly, he looked toward the security camera mounted high in the corner. The red indicator flickered weakly, unstable. And in that moment, he knew. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been recorded. There would be no evidence, no proof. Just him. And the unbearable realization that somewhere, out in the sleeping city, something ancient had awakened, not to haunt, but to hunt. The first light of dawn crept through the glass ceiling of the British Museum, staining the vast stone hall in dull shades of gray and fading purple. But Samir felt none of its warmth. He sat alone in his cramped security office, hunched forward, eyes locked on a small television screen as the morning news droned on in a controlled, professional tone that felt strangely disconnected from reality. Baffling the medical community, the anchor said, her voice calm, almost detached. Baron Klaus von Hess, 78, found dead under highly unusual circumstances. Preliminary reports describe extreme and instantaneous desiccation. The word hit him like a physical blow. Desiccation. His fingers tightened around the paper cup of tea in his hand, now gone cold. Images from the night before flooded back, the unmoving body rising, the eyes, the voice, the promise. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. Somewhere in the quiet streets of London, she had already begun. A faint current of air brushed against his face, impossibly cold, carrying with it that same dry, ancient scent. Linen, dust, something sacred and rotten at once. The door behind him hadn't opened. The windows were sealed. Still, the air moved. And he understood. It wasn't a breeze. It was a call. He found himself walking before he made the decision to move, his feet carrying him back through the vast corridors, now eerily empty, the museum feeling less like a building and more like a sealed tomb. When he reached the Egyptian gallery, she was already there, standing, waiting. The early light passed through her faintly, as if she belonged more to shadow than to the world around her. The linen that once bound her now draped loosely, almost like a queen's garment, and her presence filled the room, not loudly, but completely. Her eyes met his, ancient and knowing. "You have seen," she said, her voice scraping softly, yet echoing directly inside his mind. Samir swallowed hard, forcing words out. "Why him?" he asked, his voice barely holding together. He was just an old man. For a moment, something almost like amusement touched her expression. "No man is just anything," she replied. "He carried the blood of Hor-Pa-Kered, the priest who sealed my tomb, who erased my name, who stood beside my father as I was buried alive." Her gaze shifted briefly toward the sarcophagus, as if it were not an object, but a memory. They fled Egypt with their wealth, their lies, and their power. They became your nobles, your rulers, your masters of gold and word. They hid well, but blood does not forget. As the sunlight grew stronger, her form began to fade at the edges, like smoke unraveling. "This body cannot walk beneath Ra's gaze," she said quietly, "but night will come again." She stepped backward into the coffin with a calm finality that felt more terrifying than any rage. "And I will continue." The lid slid shut with a deep, echoing finality, leaving the room still once more. The rest of the day passed like a dream Samir couldn't wake from. Tourists flooded the museum, their laughter, chatter, and footsteps clashing violently against the truth clawing inside his mind. Children pointed at the very coffin that now held something unspeakable, their voices full of wonder, unaware that death had already walked out of it. Samir moved through his duties mechanically, smiling when required, nodding when spoken to, but inside, something had shifted. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He was a witness. And worse, he was connected. That night, when silence reclaimed the museum once more, he didn't wait. He went deeper, into the research archives, into the forgotten knowledge buried beneath polished displays. Books spread across his desk, genealogies, ancient priesthood records, obscure academic texts no one had opened in years. Hours blurred as he chased fragments across centuries, until finally, a pattern emerged. A mention of priests fleeing Egypt, hidden wealth, names that vanished, only to reappear generations later in Europe's most powerful families. His pulse quickened as he searched further, pulling up records, crests, corporate insignias. At first, they looked ordinary, lions, shields, crowns, but buried within them, subtle, almost invisible, were symbols that didn't belong. An ankh twisted into a falcon, a lotus embedded in a crest, a scarab hidden in ironwork, marks of a forgotten origin, carried silently through time. His breathing grew shallow as realization settled in. This wasn't random. It was a network, a lineage, and she was hunting it, one by one. Samir leaned back slowly, staring at the glowing screen filled with names. Powerful, untouchable names. And for the first time since the night before, a new fear took hold. Not fear of her, but of what would happen when she was done. The next morning didn't bring relief. It brought confirmation. Inside the British Museum, Samir sat frozen in the same security office, staring at the television as the world outside began to unravel in ways no one could explain. A Swiss banking patriarch dead after a fall no one witnessed. A Paris historian destroyed overnight by the sudden exposure of buried crimes. A German industrialist collapsing mid-meeting from a rupture doctors couldn't justify. To the world, these were isolated incidents, tragic, strange, coincidental. But Samir knew better. He could see the pattern forming, tightening like a noose across Europe. Each name, each face, each fall. It wasn't chaos. It was precision. It was her. The memory of her voice, calm and certain, echoed in his mind. Blood remembers. Sleep abandoned him entirely. The museum, once suffocating, now felt like the only place that still made sense. By day, he moved like a ghost among tourists. By night, he descended deeper, not into fear, but into understanding. He dug through archives, records, fragments of forgotten history, chasing a thread that refused to break. Slowly, painfully, the truth began to surface, not as a single revelation, but as a pattern hidden across centuries. Symbols buried inside family crests, names repeating across time. A serpent, coiled subtly into power itself. The priests who condemned Ankasara had not vanished. They had adapted, evolved, disguising themselves within wealth, influence, and legacy. Samir began to see it everywhere. Not history, but a continuity. A living thing. He named it, almost unconsciously, the serpent's vein. That night, drawn once again by something he no longer questioned, he returned to the Egyptian gallery. She was there, waiting, not as a wandering spirit, but as something far more composed, a ruler observing her kingdom. Moonlight filtered through the glass above, catching her form in a way that made her seem both present and untouchable. "They are falling," Samir said quietly, the weight of it pressing into his voice. She turned slowly, her gaze meeting his with unsettling clarity. "It is only the beginning," she replied. There was no anger in her tone, only inevitability. When he showed her what he had found, the network, the symbols, the lineage, something like approval passed across her expression. "You see now," she said. "They did not die. They spread. They thrived. They ruled." Samir hesitated, then asked the question that had been building inside him all day. "And when you're done? When they're all gone?" For the first time, something deeper stirred in her eyes. Not rage, not even vengeance. Something far more absolute. "Gone is not enough," she said softly. "Death leaves echoes, memory, legacy." She stepped closer, and the air around him tightened. "I will erase them, completely. They will never have existed." The words landed with a weight that bent reality itself. She spoke then of a chamber beneath the city, older than London, a line to stars that no longer ruled the sky, a place where time itself could be rewritten. A ritual, not to kill, but to unmake. Samir felt the ground shift beneath everything he believed. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was annihilation of history itself. "What does it need?" he asked, though part of him already feared the answer. She paused, just briefly. A catalyst, she said. The final echo of the blood that betrayed me. And then, just as before, she withdrew into shadow, leaving the words behind like a sentence already passed. Something inside Samir refused to stay still after that. A catalyst. A final echo. The words wouldn't let him rest. Back in the office, under the harsh artificial light, he began again. This time not searching outward, but inward. His own name. His own past. It felt irrational at first, almost desperate, but the deeper he went, the more something began to itch beneath the surface. His father's lineage, simple, traceable, nothing unusual. But his mother's side? There were gaps, missing pieces. His grandmother, adopted, records incomplete, origins unclear. A loose thread. His pulse began to rise as he dug further, cross-referencing fragments, migration patterns, old records barely digitized. Then something surfaced. A name. Ancient. Obscure. A minor priest, barely mentioned in historical texts. Khepri, one of the lesser figures tied to the same order that had condemned Ankasara. His lineage had scattered, fragmented, disappearing into history, only to reappear, diluted, hidden, reborn under different names across centuries. Samir's breath grew shallow as the pieces aligned with terrifying precision. His fingers moved slowly to his pocket, pulling out the small locket his mother had given him years ago. He had never questioned it, never looked closely. But now, as he opened it under the light, the design inside revealed itself, not decorative, deliberate. A serpent, coiled, watching. The realization didn't hit like a shock. It sank in, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't just witnessing this. He wasn't just connected to it. He was part of it. The chant, the awakening, the timing, none of it was accidental. He stared at his own reflection in the darkened screen, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. The truth settled with a final, irreversible certainty. He wasn't just the witness. He was the key, the last echo, the end of the serpent's vein. The cold beneath London felt alive that night. Not the usual damp chill of the underground, but something deeper. Electric, ancient, pulsing through the rails and concrete like a buried heartbeat. Samir moved through the abandoned tunnel, guided only by the star chart in his trembling hand and the pull he could no longer ignore. The deeper he went, the more the air changed. Thick with ozone, dry as desert wind, carrying whispers of something older than the city above. When he finally broke through into the hidden chamber, his breath stopped. The space shouldn't have existed beneath modern London. A vast circular void where the floor itself was a living map of the stars, glowing in shifting constellations that didn't belong to this era. At the center, suspended in a vortex of pale blue energy, stood Ankasara, no longer a figure of shadow, but something vast, almost divine, her form wrapped in symbols that moved like living fire. This was not revenge anymore. This was power rewriting reality. "Ankasara!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the hum. Her eyes opened, blinding, celestial. No trace of the woman he had spoken to in the quiet museum nights. "You should not have come." Her voice echoed from everywhere at once. But Samir stepped forward anyway, the star map burning cold beneath his feet. "You don't understand what you're about to do," he said, forcing the words through fear. "This doesn't end with them." A faint smile touched her lips, beautiful, terrifying. "It ends exactly as it should," she said. "They will not die. They will be erased, as if they never poisoned this world." The chamber pulsed in response, the ritual reaching its peak. Samir's heart pounded as he pulled out the truth he had been running from. "The bloodline you want to erase. It ends with me." The words cracked the air itself. For the first time, the energy faltered. Silence rippled outward. Ankasara descended slowly, her gaze locking onto him, not as a force, but as something searching. "You," she whispered, stepping closer. "The last echo." Her eyes traced his face, and for a moment, something ancient and dangerous flickered. Recognition, hatred, fate aligning perfectly. The energy gathered violently in her hand, a single point of light capable of unmaking everything. "Then it ends here," she said, raising it toward him. Samir closed his eyes, bracing for nothingness. But what filled his mind wasn't fear. It was her. The quiet conversations, the stories, the loneliness behind her rage. And something shifted. The light didn't strike. When he opened his eyes, she was frozen. Her hand trembling, her expression breaking. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a bloodline. She was looking at him. A man who had listened, who had seen her as more than a curse. A tear formed, impossible, fragile, and fell. 3,000 years, she whispered, voice cracking under a weight no ritual could carry. And I became the same as him. The light dimmed. The storm collapsed inward. Slowly, she lowered her hand. "He was the sin," she said, softer now. "Not you." She wasn't stopping the ritual. She was changing it. Instead of erasing the bloodline, she turned the power inward. "Then let it end with me." Before Samir could react, the energy surged, not outward into the world, but into her. The entire chamber trembled as the star map began collapsing, the constellations folding into her form. She wasn't destroying the bloodline. She was severing it at its origin, herself. Because without her death, without her story, the betrayal would never exist. The cause, removed. The effect, erased. Samir screamed her name, but it was too late. Her form broke apart into light, dissolving into the very stars that had bound her. The chamber went dark, silent, empty. When Samir stumbled back to the surface, the world felt wrong. Not broken, clean. News screens flickered across London, but the stories were different now. No collapsing dynasties, no scandals, no mysterious deaths. The powerful families still existed, but without the hidden rot, without the centuries of buried crimes. It was as if something had been quietly corrected. History hadn't been destroyed. It had been rewritten. Back at the British Museum, Samir stood before the sarcophagus. It was sealed, untouched. The name Ankasara, gone from the records entirely. No exhibit, no mention, no trace. Only one thing remained. In his pocket, the locket felt heavier than before. He opened it. The serpent was gone.